Okay, I'm going to try something a little different today. There may be some audio issues. Might be a little too loud, but I'm going to give it a shot. You can call me Onesimus. That was a very common slave name in the time of Paul, and it meant useful. And I hope I can live up to that. I haven't been feeling well, and that's okay. I don't ever really feel well, and but anyway, I got a little pep in my step today, and thought we would have a little fun. And it might not be what everybody thinks is fun, but it's what I think is fun. We're going to take a look at some just kind of surface level truths of the Bible that a lot of people overlook, and they're really kind of in shock when I make them aware of it. They just really never thought of it. And what we're going to cover today is something that really helped me a lot in understanding that even I could be saved. I guess the question is, who can be saved? And in answering that question, who can be saved, I think it's a little better to kind of backtrack a little bit and look at, okay, well, let's not ask ourselves who can be saved. Let's ask ourselves, who has God used for his purposes? And when we put all this together, when it all gels and congeals, it's a very kind of abstract look at the facts of the Bible. But I'm going to start with a question, and I'm going to give you my answer to the question when we get to the end of this. If it were up to you, if God said to you, look, I've got someone I need to come to a decision on whether or not they qualify for forgiveness and whether or not I should forgive them, and you know what? I'm just going to let it be in your hands. If God said, look, this person here, I don't know what to do with them, and I want you to make that decision for me, what would you decide? Some of you may not know who Jeffrey Dahmer is, but especially younger people, but he was a serial killer. He was a cannibal. The guy really did some pretty heinous stuff. He was a character for sure. And when you think about his actions and whether or not that was offensive to God, it was just about as offensive as you can get, eating humans and killing people. Or murdering people, not necessarily killing. There's a difference between killing and murdering. But anyway, if God said, look, should I forgive Jeffrey Dahmer or not? Could you forgive Jeffrey Dahmer? He's a murderer and a cannibal. So, just kind of keep that in your head. Don't make a decision yet. But anyway, we're going to talk about some of the main people God used in the Bible. I would go as far as to say the top 3 people, main people, that God used in the Bible, and that so much of the Bible kind of points to, and so much of the Bible was written by, and these people were used to kind of clarify God's intentions and thoughts and even his word for us. So we'll start early, and we'll talk about Moses. Moses, if you don't know, I'm just going to try to hit it pretty quick. Moses was who God used to take the nation of Israel out of Egypt from slavery and basically free them. But anyway, it gets pretty deep, but I'll try to just kind of hit this hard and fast. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, and this is out in Egypt. He was basically ended up there as a baby and was raised as an Egyptian. But now, as it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his fellow Hebrews and looked at their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his fellow Hebrews. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no one around, he struck and killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. Now when he went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other, and he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But the companion said, or the Hebrew said, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." Basically, when we kind of break this down into, the words, he saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, and then he was looking around. Moses was looking around to see if anyone was looking. Why was he looking around to see if anyone was looking? It's because he knew he was about to do something wicked. Did he have to kill the Egyptian for beating the Hebrew? Well, not really. I mean, in a way, the Egyptian was just doing his job. I mean, they kind of had to make people submit. They were slaves, and I'm talking chattel slavery, where people are basically abducted and forced into labor. That's chattel slavery. But anyway, so he was looking around, and he didn't think there was anybody around to see it, and he struck and killed the Egyptian. He murdered that Egyptian. Now, there are some people who say that under Jewish law at the time, he didn't technically murder the Egyptian, but, I mean, come on. He was looking around to see if people were looking to see what he was going to do, and then murdered the guy. I mean, come on, he murdered him. So anyway, and then the Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." I mean, why was he afraid? He was afraid because he knew he was guilty of murder. So when you break it down, Moses was a murderer. He didn't have to kill the Egyptian. Moses was, I guess, sort of in a position of some degree of power or pull or influence. Because Pharaoh's daughter was who, kind of brought him in when he was orphaned. But so anyway, Moses was a murderer. Now let's think about what God used him to do. I'm in the wrong place here. So God used Moses to give Israel the commandments, the 10 Commandments. He used them to take, God used Moses to take Israel out of Egypt. And he also used Moses to write 5 books of the Bible. Moses wrote Genesis, which was the creation account. He wrote Exodus, was basically the story of Israel leaving Egypt. And then Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. These were the first 5 books of the Bible. They're called the Pentateuch. But anyway, God used Moses, and God knew Moses murdered the Egyptian, He used him to take the nation of Israel out. He used them to do the 10 Commandments and 5 books of the Bible. When you look at this, a lot of people don't realize that on the surface level here, God used a murderer to do these things. And does he have anyone that's not corrupt? Does he have anyone who's not a sinner to use? No, he doesn't. He has to use us. But anyway, so we've got one person here, Moses, and then we'll go to another person, a person that God said was a man after his own heart, and that would have been David, King David. So anyway, and actually, God would basically make his only begotten son in the line of David. Mary, Jesus' mother, was in the line of David. Even Joseph, even though he was not the biological, father of Jesus, he was in David's line too, so that there would be no question. But anyway, David was a shepherd, and God, he was just a little shepherd boy and not a big guy or anything like that. He was unremarkable. And God used him to do a lot of great things. You've probably heard of David and Goliath and all that. But anyway, King David, God had really blessed him a lot. And David kind of got smitten by this woman. Her name was Bathsheba. She was bathing. She was gorgeous, just a beautiful woman. And David, he's a man. He's in a position of power, and he decided he wanted to get to know her, if you know what I mean. And he sent his servants to inquire about her. And anyway, come to find out, that woman Bathsheba, she was the wife of one of David's best soldiers. At the time they were warring, and anyway, Uriah was her husband. He was out at battle, fighting for the King David. And David ended up, kind of getting intimately involved with Bathsheba. And she had let him know at some point that she was pregnant. And that kind of freaked David out a little bit. And David sent, word to his, I guess the upper echelon that was around, the military echelon that was around Uriah to call him home. And what the idea was to call him home, get him to lay down with his wife, give him a little leave here. And maybe he would, mess around with his wife and come to think that the kid was his at some point. Because if he was out for battle for months and then, he comes home and she's pregnant, well, we got an issue here. So anyway, David told him, hey, when he got back, he came and reported to David, and King David told him, yeah, go home and wash your feet. And, basically he was wanting him to hang out and let the wife kind of put the moves on him and lay down with him and kind of cover up the dirty work, Well, Uriah was faithful, and, at the time they probably had something to where, if you were going back into battle the next day or whatever, you didn't go down to your house and lay with your woman. And basically there was some word, some statement from Uriah about, what his men were enduring and, his fellow soldiers were enduring and all this stuff. And he just didn't feel good about going and being comfortable at home and everything. And he kind of roughed it and slept, I guess, near the entrance or the door of the king's quarters or whatever. And so anyway, Uriah didn't go lay with his wife, so that wasn't working. And King David basically summoned Uriah and, got Uriah to eat and get drunk and all that. And Uriah still didn't end up going down to his house, to his wife, to lay with her. So David knew that there was a problem. He wasn't going to do that. So King David wrote a letter to Joab, which was one of the higher ups in the military over Uriah, and he sent this letter by the hand of Uriah. In other words, Uriah carried this letter himself. And King David knew that Uriah was a trustworthy enough man that he wouldn't look at that letter, that he would, be loyal. And this is the saddest thing, really. And I'll read it right out of the text here. So in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He had written in the letter the following: station Uriah at the front line of the fiercest battle and pull back from him so that he may be struck and killed. basically, King David had sent a letter with Uriah that was his own, basically, death notice. He had Uriah sent to the front line of the battle, and he knew that Uriah was a faithful soldier, that he wouldn't turn and run. He would fight to the death. And they pulled back the support from Uriah, and he was struck and killed. So anyway, that made King David a murderer. That made King David, a man who God said was a man after his own heart, that made him a murderer. And not only was he a murderer, but he was an adulterer. You know, he had laid with this man's wife, and this man was one of David's probably most loyal soldiers. So let's talk about what God used King David for. God used David to write, I hate that scrolling action there. God used King David to write some of the Psalms. And part of the Psalms that were written were after David had Uriah murdered, basically, or had killed Uriah. And it really humbled David. It really, really humbled him. He felt so far from God. So far from him. But still, David, no matter how far he felt from God, he still approached God and, you know, basically begged for forgiveness and begged to have that closeness again. But, so we've hit Moses and King David. Now we're going to hit, like, the super saint, Paul. You know, I don't know what I was doing here. But oh yeah, that's right. We're going to hit the Apostle Paul. Now, prior to becoming an apostle, his name was Saul. And basically, Saul was like a up-and-coming, really kind of hardcore lawyer of the time. And by lawyer, I mean someone who had studied the biblical law and was an expert in the biblical law. So anyway, he thought, Saul did, we're going to call him Saul for now. Saul thought that Jesus Christ, and the Christians were going against the law, you know, the biblical law. He thought that what they were doing was blasphemy, because Jesus was saying that basically, I am God. I'm the Son of God, which basically made him equal with God. And they didn't like that, and it was offensive to them. It was offensive to their sensibilities. He was telling them they were wrong about their understanding of things. And so anyway, Saul had made it his duty to eradicate Christianity, basically. And he was kind of going around rounding up the Christians and, you know, having them crucified and this and that. But anyway, just really, really persecuting the Christians hardcore. But I'll read a little bit out of this. I don't know how far I'm going to go with it. But anyway, the conversion of Saul, and this is in Acts 9. Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way was Christianity, whether men or women, he might bring them in shackles to Jerusalem. Now as he was traveling, it happened that he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly saw a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And Jesus said, I am Jesus, who you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and it will be told to you what you must do. Now think about this. You're just a regular human being, and then you basically, if you had the opportunity, you'd probably kill Jesus if you could, yourself, and you'd kill all the Christians you could because you thought they were, blaspheming God. He thought he was doing the right thing. Well, he goes here and he sees this sight that's, otherworldly. It's not of this world. It's definitely a divine thing that's going on here. And no matter who it is, you're going to kind of like snap to it and do whatever they tell you to do. So you can imagine Saul's shock to see this person that he thought was just a blaspheming human come to him in this form and tell him, look, this is what you're going to do. So anyway, we're going to look back at that again and think about this first verse. Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Saul was basically ordering the killing of Christians. He was ordering that. That made him a murderer. There was murder on his lips when Christ came to him. I mean, think about how humbled he was by that. Here you are, you're wanting to go murder Christians, and then the very person, or the very, person they're following comes to you in this form, and you realize instantly that you were wrong. Imagine how humbled he was. That moment right there was what fueled Paul's humility, his low opinion of himself. He called himself the chief of sinners. And in a way, I guess he really, really felt that was right, because, okay, well, let's look at Moses. Moses killed an Egyptian, a stranger, who was actively beating someone that he cared about. And, King David, he murdered to cover up his sexual misconduct. And, even that's kind of a little easier to understand than Paul. Paul is like trying to eradicate Christianity, basically. He's trying to totally diminish the ministry of God himself when he came here to minister to us. So you look at these men, Moses and David and Paul, and they were murderers. And let's look at what Paul used, or God used Paul for. When we kind of take a step back, Paul was an amazing legal mind. He was very talented in the Old Testament law, and he was one of your people. You could probably go ask him anything about the Old Testament. He was going to be able to give you an answer. But let's look at what God used Paul for. He used Paul for the Pauline epistles, which would be Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. You look at that, that's a majority, really, of the letters in the New Testament. Paul being such a great legal mind, God used him to clarify the gospel for us. He used Paul to speak to us about clarifying what we are to understand about his word. One of the main themes was that we're saved by faith, not works. And that was one of the main misconceptions and misunderstandings up until that time, was You know, the Jews thought that it was about works. It was about checking off this list of 10 commandments and what have you, and traditions of man, and doing all this stuff. And you know, they were whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. They on the outside, everything looked great, and it looked like they were doing it, but on the inside, they had no salvation. But anyway, these are the people that Paul used, or God used. So when we look at who can be saved, you know, who can be used by God for his purposes. And, you know, when I look at Moses, was Moses saved? I'm sure he was. Was King David saved? I'm sure he was. Was Paul saved? I'm sure he was. Now, God used other people, you know, to do things in the Bible, and it doesn't mean that everyone God uses is saved, but when God uses people to this degree, they're his. They belong to him. So when you get back to the men of the Bible, you know, some of the men of the Bible, and these three main men that were used by God, even to write his word, you know, I like to ask people, what do Moses and King David and the Apostle Paul and Jeffrey Dahmer have in common? They are all murderers. And a lot of people look at me like they're puzzled, and they're just in shock, like, oh, you called Paul the Apostle a murderer. You called Moses a murderer. You called King David a murderer. Well, I mean, if you actually read the Word of God, they're murderers. I mean, it's not hard to figure out here. But, you know, God forgave Moses for killing that Egyptian. He forgave David for having Uriah killed. He forgave Paul for having Christians killed. He forgave Paul for basically calling him a blasphemer. But when I look at Jeffrey Dahmer, you know, apparently he had come to some faith in God, and he wanted to be baptized. And on that day he was baptized, someone else was executed. It might have been John Wayne Gacy or something. I don't know who it was. But anyway, someone else, some serial killer or somebody, was executed the day he was baptized, and there was a total solar eclipse on that day he was baptized. You know, Jeffrey Dahmer, he was baptized. And I think about Jeffrey Dahmer in comparison to these other people. Did Moses understand his guilt? Of course he did. He understood it before he killed the Egyptian. Did David understand his guilt? Yes, he understood his guilt. You know, he felt terrible about it. He wrote about it in Psalms. Did Paul understand his guilt? Yes, he understood his guilt. He understood his guilt from the moment Christ appeared to him on the Damascus Road. Did Jeffrey Dahmer understand his guilt? He absolutely understood his guilt. One thing all these men had in common as well was humility. They had a low opinion of themselves. They had a low opinion of their own actions. They knew they were murderers. They repented. They didn't just keep doing it, you know. Now, Jeffrey Dahmer, he had quite a run of murder and cannibalism and everything. And I can't imagine if he truly came to Christ. I can't imagine how humbled Jeffrey Dahmer was. I can't imagine the thoughts that entered his mind when he prayed. You know, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. There's a lot of depth in that one little sentence. Knowing your position, being humble, knowing that you're not perfect, knowing that you're corrupt and you're wicked. That's the foundation for salvation. If you don't know you need to be saved, if you don't understand your corruption, how can you really ask to be saved? What are you being saved from? You know, are you perfect and a good person? Are you being saved from your goodness? No, you're being saved from your wickedness. You know, you're being saved from the things that run through your mind that no one else hears. You know, we've got those slow sins and we've got fast sins. And with slow sins, we'll look at Moses. You know, Moses had time to look around, see if no one was looking, and then killed the Egyptian. That was not a fast sin. That was, you know, there was some thought there. He looked around, see if anybody's going to see him, and he killed him. You look at David. That was not a fast sin. That was a, you know, wickedly planned, deceitful operation he had going there. That was some really conniving, weaselly, low-life stuff. And you look at Paul. I mean, Paul went as far as, you know, going and getting letters, giving him permission to go round people up so that they can be, you know, persecuted, you know, and murdered and stuff. And that was a really slow sin. And you look at Jeffrey Dahmer, and his stuff was calculated. You know, he was going out to bars and meeting people and putting stuff in their drinks and this and that. And it was calculated, you know. It was really calculated. They were slow sins. Now, back to fast sins, you know, what are the fast sins? The fast sins are when you look at someone and think, wow, well, they're ugly or whatever, or you sin quickly with your tongue. You say something you really shouldn't have, or you say something really mean, you know, or you just think something. But with the eyes, you know, with the tongue, with the mind, we sin quickly. With the hands and the other members of the body, we sin slowly. And all of these men, they had those slow sins in common. Murder. You don't just, you know, murder someone like a crossword flies from your mouth. But anyway, you know, could I forgive Jeffrey Dahmer? I don't see where I have a standing to not forgive the man, you know? If all these other murderers can be forgiven, what keeps him from being forgiven? You know? But when you look at who can be forgiven, anyone can be forgiven. All can be forgiven. You look at the people that God used. He used murderers. He used anyone he could. Why? Because there wasn't any good people to use. Not one is good. No, not even one. But anyway, if you know, you've probably got some stuff rattling around your mind that you're not real proud of, and you know is pretty offensive to God. And it is what it is. We all have that. And if you think you can't be saved, you really got another thing coming. I mean, you can be saved, even if you're a murderer. It doesn't get much more offensive than that, taking a life. You know? You can't harm anyone worse than taking their very life from them. But anyway, I wanted to do a verse of the day. And where was it? This, you know, this is kind of my go-to chapter. This is James 1. And this is one of my favorite verses. There's a whole lot of depth in it. But it's James chapter 1, verse 2. Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. We think about the good things, the truly good characteristics and traits, the things God would prefer to see in us. Patience, mercy, grace, forgiveness, a long-suffering nature, wisdom, understanding, things like that. And we don't ever consider what it's going to take for us to get those things. No one really grows in a positive way when everything's just peachy. Most of us grow the most when we are suffering, when we are failing, when things are challenging, when they're difficult, when we are crushed. But consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. A tested faith is the most valuable thing we will ever possess. There's nothing else we can possess that is worth more than that. So anyway, I hope you leave here with a little bit more understanding than you had when you came. And know that when you're forgiving of someone who doesn't deserve it, when you're patient with someone who doesn't deserve it, when you show mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it, know you're being godlike. If you want to follow Christ, those are the things we got to do, and much more, But in action, we need to be those things: forgiving, graceful, patient. But anyway, I kind of rambled and jumped around a little bit, but I think you get the general idea. So ask yourself, if God left it up to you, could you forgive Jeffrey Dahmer? But anyway, have a good day. Think a little deeper, think a little harder.